Welcome to this installment of ATARC's Federal IT Newscast. I'm Jim Richberg, the field CISO at Fortinet for the public sector, and I've been hosting this series for a year and a half. And my guest today is Ken Myers from the U.S. General Services Administration, or GSA. Ken, welcome to this newscast.
Hey, thank you very much, Jim. Looking forward to a great conversation today.
So you've had an interesting career, Ken. How did you end up at GSA, and well, what's your role there?
Yeah, so actually I started my career as an active duty Marine. I spent 9 years in the Marine Corps as a radio technician, which slowly evolved into network engineer. So there are some cybersecurity aspects of that, and that's really where I cut my teeth on cybersecurity and identity management. Actually, I have a passion for identity. Digital identity, depending if it's a workforce use case, public use case, it's just a very fascinating field. But I joined GSA in August of 2020 as the Chief Federal Identity, Credential and Access Management Architect. It was actually a pretty interesting role. So the federal government has a government-wide enterprise architecture called the FICAM, Federal Identity, Credential and Access Management Architecture. And this government-wide enterprise architecture is maintained by GSA in collaboration with the Office of Management and Budget, and then also our partners over at Department of Homeland Security. And so we maintain this together, and it's a list of best practices across the various aspects of workforce identity. And so my main responsibility when I first joined GSA was actually modernizing that FICAM architecture to meet government-wide enterprise architecture best practices. And then that slowly evolved when OMB Memo 2209 came out, our federal zero trust strategy, about aligning the FICAM architecture to that. And actually today, I'm the director of the Identity Assurance and Trusted Access Division. That includes the FICAM initiative within it, but we also have three other functional areas as well. If you've heard of the federal public key infrastructure, the federal PKI, it's where the digital certificates on our PIV card come from.
Right. Well, identity is key to so much of this, and we're going to talk a little bit more about zero trust a little bit later in this. But you know, it's for somebody who spent 34 years in the federal government. I have seen the evolution of GSA from the landlord of physical infrastructure now to having a key role as the custodian of so much of the digital infrastructure, things like identity and the FICAM scheme for the federal government. So yes, it's just further attestation that the approach to this has gone digital in the federal government. So you already talked about partnership within the federal government, but what do you see as the role for partnership on IT and security within the government and then with others, with industry and with academia? Clearly, you're not doing it all by yourself.
Yeah, true. I mean, maybe you've seen other types of partnerships in your experience, but one thing I've noticed is, we all have kind of common challenges, yet we try to solve them individually. And that's really where the key of partnerships come in, right? We bring that knowledge together, we bring that time and experience together, and we try to solve it as a team. So there's like fantastic examples of government, industry, and academic partnerships. So one right now that my office is doing, so the ATARC Identity Management Lab is collaborating with our FIPS, which is the Federal Information Processing Standard 201, their FIPS 201 evaluation program, to potentially test fast identity online, or FIDO2 authenticators. That's the authenticators that are mentioned in the federal zero trust strategy. So we're having ATARC partners and also federal use cases looked at within our physical access security lab. I mean, that's just one example. Some other examples that come to mind really are from an academic standpoint. Our office works very closely with NIST on identity standards. NIST has fantastic partnerships right now around post-quantum cryptography in evaluating those. Can you think of other partnerships that you've seen?
That was the one that I was going to mention, Ken, was, after that 6-year process, NIST announced the 4 successful candidates for the quantum resistant algorithms. And then of course you saw that the next month, when a broader set, when it got crowdsourced, someone found a way to defeat one of those. Now it was one that had been viewed as probably the lightest weight of the 4. But the thing that I saw as somebody who was not only in government, but was in the national security and intelligence community part of it, is there was the temptation to solve your problem on your own, to in many cases reinvent a wheel that others in industry, other parts of government, mostly in industry, have found ways to solve. So I certainly saw this as the guy who was the overseer of the implementation of our whole of government cybersecurity initiative put together under President Bush, and then that ran under President Obama, the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, where we were working in a vacuum. We thought of the private sector largely as victims. We go to them and say, you've been breached. No, I haven't. Well, yes, we found your intellectual property overseas. And then we had that conversation. Well, they actually had solved some very foundational cybersecurity problems about networking, about collective situational awareness, and about response that we frankly, even at my level, and I was a sort of undersecretary level person, did not know about in government. So it's really, these partnerships you're talking about, Ken, I think are really key to avoiding the government reinventing a wheel when there's a perfectly good tire shop worth of them out there that they should leverage.
Yeah, I mean, another example, the FEDRAMP program is another one that works with industry and third-party attestation, and also the DMD or the DoD cybersecurity maturity model. I mean, I know they just published the version 2 of that, but that's an interesting one to look at also.
Well, and that was one where you could argue in part that there was the necessity to change that because so many people in industry looked at the first version and said, we are integral partners in this. We really don't know how to implement this. A lot of it seems subjective in terms of the scoring. We have to spend real money on something when it seems if we had a different assessor come in, we might get a different outcome. So that was very much one where I think partnership led DoD to say we might need to rethink this. We agree on what the goal should be, better protection of this unclassified information, but we think that based on our partnership and dialogue with our partners, there's going to be a different way to solve it. Now, we've already started talking a little bit about zero trust, Ken, and zero trust clearly was a primary focus of President Biden's cybersecurity executive order last year, 14028. And digital identity seems to be at the core of zero trust and of so many other aspects of digital transformation. So you already started to touch on this, but what do you see as GSA's role in this broader identity, credential, and access management function for the federal government?
So GSA actually has 2 primary roles within identity, credential, and access management. So the first is obviously our office, the Office of Governmentwide Policy, where I sit, and then we help not only govern the enterprise architecture, but we also collaborate with the Office of Management and Budget and implementing and coordinating those government-wide initiatives. So federal PKI is one of them. FICAM Architecture is another. Our community of practice, for example, the Federal CISO Council has an ICAM subcommittee where each of the CFO Act and to some extent the non-CFO Acts come, discuss their challenges. Those get shared back to the Office of Management Budget, and we try to update and align our policies with that as well.
Okay.
Also within GSA, we also have our Federal Acquisition Service. And so if you think about GSA and the 3 parts of GSA, the Federal Acquisition Service operates and manages services. So I mentioned the federal PKI. They operate the public key infrastructure. That's the root of our personal identity verification card. They also operate the managed service offering, or MSO, which issues PIV cards at the U.S. Access Program. Are the technology transformation service within the Federal Acquisition Service. They operate login.gov. So login.gov is that public facing, that public user identity verification and authentication tool that a lot of agencies are looking at, but something that a lot of state and locals don't know is they can also use login.gov through the Intergovernmental Cooperation Act. So it's not just a federal service. There's some identity services in addition to our multiple award schedules that state and local can leverage also. And actually, part of those multiple award schedules I mentioned, right, there's 2 aspects of identity. There's the logical access of someone trying to log into an application, but we can't forget the physical aspect of it also. So the GSA multiple award schedules includes both the logical, physical, and public key infrastructure. And if you go to our website, which is idmanagement.gov, we break it down. We break information down versus if you're a vendor, an acquisition professional, or a federal program manager. And so you can find specific information to kind of meet your needs. I'll just mention one last thing so GSA also invests in zero trust projects through the Technology modernization fund. And so that TMF actually has 4 active zero trust projects right now. So GSA, we're working as a cohort to plan and share learning based on those projects with other agencies making similar investments.
Mhm. So we've clearly been talking about zero trust at the federal level, and I do a lot of work with state and local government. They are frankly still grappling with what zero trust is and trying to figure out how to get started on it. How much of these, you talked about services and documentation that was available for acquisition professionals. In my conversation with state and local government, it's especially imperative that they don't reinvent the wheel. If I'm in local government, they don't have a lot of people doing acquisition. They aren't experts in many cases in IT or certainly in security. So is there GSA documentation that we could make available, you could make available to partners in state and local government? Do you already do that? I mean, is there something you can point them to say, look, if you want to figure out how to do identity management for zero trust or for cloud access, here's where you go. Don't have to use it, but it's a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple great resources. I mentioned idmanagement.gov. So we publish the FICAM best practices in the FICAM architecture, but also kind of accompanying guidance. And actually today with our federal zero trust strategy, so FICAM has 5 focus areas to align your organization's identity infrastructure towards those zero trust principles. And actually, while those 5 focus areas aren't named specifically on our playbooks.idmanagement.gov website, we should be orienting our structure towards that. So if you go to playbooks.idmanagement.gov right now, you can see some of that in our top level navigation. You can see the identity, credential, and access management components that can help you align to some of those zero trust identity pillars. Outside of idmanagement.gov, our CIO.gov website, which is our federal CIO council, they have fantastic technology information that talks about cloud optimization. And that comes out of our data center and cloud optimization community practice, which is also under the Federal CIO Council. I know in the Federal Acquisition Service, they published a Zero Trust Buyer's Guide on how to use GSA services to procure or acquire kind of some of those zero trust capabilities. And that's the Zero Trust Buyer Guide is something that they publish. Also on idmanagement.gov, in partnership with the Federal Acquisition Service, we published an ICAM services roadmap that both federal, state, and local can utilize. I'll just do one last mention for our FICAM architecture guidance. While it is kind of federally focused, it's technology and vendor agnostic. So really any organization, whether that's federal, state, local government, or even private sector companies, can go and look at that guidance and kind of understand best practices for implementing different parts of identity, credential, and access management.
Yeah, and because I talked about the necessity or the value of government not reinventing the wheel. The same applies the other way around. If government, and from my perspective, as somebody who cut his teeth in national security, we had need to know way back before it was sexy. Before we had networks, we had physical segmentation of buildings. You couldn't go certain places if you didn't have certain things on your badge. So government, from my perspective, pioneered the concept of zero trust. It took industry, really the IT sector, after a series of major breaches, to figure out how to do it globally, with an internet-facing network, because as you knew from the Marine Corps, as I saw from other things, the government had global networks, but the way we secured a lot of them was we air-gapped them from the internet, from the outside world. Well, the private sector figured out how to do that. And I think it took the executive order to bring this convergence where government, who had pioneered the concepts, then was working with the private sector on implementation. So it's really important, I think, for neither side to reinvent the wheel. And in this case, government is really good at doing a lot of the technology and vendor agnostic, neutral ways of thinking about a problem, the conceptualizations, and then making that available to others who say, I can put a product against that. I see a specific technology. Private sector, don't reinvent a wheel any more than government, right? I mean, there's not enough of us to go around. Don't waste your time doing something somebody else has already done well, right?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's similar to the when we're talking about partnerships, right? We all have similar challenges, yet we try to solve them individually when they're actually kind of group challenges. We're all faced with employees accessing our systems, partners accessing our systems. If we have customer facing applications, Similar challenges, and we can solve them in similar ways.
Yeah, yeah. So Ken, you've already mentioned OMB. OMB announced their administration cybersecurity priorities for the fiscal year 24 budget, and zero trust and accelerated adoption of secure cloud infrastructure are prominent. So we've talked about the importance of digital identity. How is the FICAM architecture adapting to these priorities and this accelerated migration to cloud?
So I've heard of zero trust mentioned in both two aspects. One, cybersecurity initiative, but also from an operational business perspective. And I think it's interesting to look at it from both of those. So from the FICAM architecture perspective, I mentioned we have 5 focus areas or 5 priorities that are aligned with the federal zero trust strategy. The first priority is creating a master user record. For those that are familiar with the DHS Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program, master user record is kind of the foundation identity as part of that. And actually, about 2 months ago, the ICAM subcommittee published an identity lifecycle management playbook, which is available on playbooks.idmanagement.gov, that outlines what is a master user record, why is it necessary, and then some simple steps on planning guidance, right? It doesn't tell you how to do it, but it gives you kind of best practices to understand what are the kind of gotchas and kind of methods of implementing it. A second priority is single sign-on. If you look at OMB Memo 2209, it talks about centralizing identity management and centralizing access, and that's most likely through a single sign-on tool. About a year ago, we published a single sign-on playbook and a cloud version of the single sign-on playbook called the Cloud Identity Playbook. You mentioned FY24 budget priorities. It talks about accelerated adoption of secure cloud infrastructure, and so we're trying to help agencies understand what are the best practices around using an identity as a service, and specifically a FedRAMP identity as a service. So third priority there is multiple phishing resistant MFA options. So again, OMB Memo 2209 talk about when PIV or derived PIV is impractical, still use a phishing resistant option. And so that phishing resistant option will actually be outlined in a soon to be published NIST special publication. For those familiar with the Digital Identity Guidelines 863, they should be publishing a new version of that fairly soon, hopefully, to help explain what that phishing resistant is. So the fourth priority area, fine grain authorization. So that's not only using those device level signals to access an application, but also a little bit of the role management that happens within an application. The last priority area is managing the privileged users. And so this actually was a hot topic probably around 2012, right? Insider threat mitigation, some of the breaches that happen with administrators compromising data. And so really the intent of managing privileged users is making sure that you understand who your highest risk users are and that you have proper controls. And we're actually about to publish a privileged identity playbook here in the next couple of weeks that combine that and then also talk about best practices. Again, privileged users is also a DHS CDM, continuous diagnostics and mitigation core competency within that program. And so this was actually a close partnership that we had with the CDM program. It was actually pretty exciting.
Yeah, you hit you two things. I mean, we managed to get 15 minutes into this before you mentioned NIST, which is, I'm sure there are major partners of GSAs on a lot of this stuff. And, you hit one of my hot button terms, which is insider threat, because, I ran the damage assessment program for the US government for a number of years. I get that there are bad apples in a bushel of any appreciable size, but my experience both in government and the private sector was that in the aggregate, organizations, including government agencies, suffered more damage from people making mistakes, from people being human, than they did from people who set out to be malicious. And that the term insider risk was frankly more helpful than insider threat. Insider threat sounded Orwellian, sounded like, Big Brother, and I'm here to look over your shoulder, as opposed to insider risk, which, whether we didn't give you the tools, whether we recognize we're asking you to do things, too many things at a time, we're a safety net. We've got your back, rather than we're looking over your shoulder. And it doesn't mean it doesn't look for people who aren't setting out to cause harm, but it is, from my perspective, more helpful in dealing with the workforce. Never a good conversation when you go to the cafeteria, sit down and say, "Hi, I'm from the insider threat program."
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point. I mean, within the privileged identity playbook, it has a table of the types of insider risk that could happen. And even today, we can see in like kind of big breaches, there's a big one called multi-factor authentication fatigue, right? MFA fatigue,
Yeah.
where an adversary keeps constantly doing that push notification, and on that employee who doesn't know any better may just, accept it, not realizing what they're doing. And so, I mean, that's an excellent point.
But yeah, I've had conversations with organizations that have had overprivileged accounts, admin accounts, and too many of them. Have an organization that has 10,000 users and had 1,000 admin accounts. You look at it and you go, wow, that's way out of proportion. You have old ones, you have ones that, to your point, can be accessed remotely without two-factor authentication. I mean, yes, I certainly think your playbook is going to be vital in this area of saying, here are best practices for how you manage these privileged users.
And I'm curious from your perspective. Again, I'll mention NIST. So NIST recently published an interagency report on integrating cybersecurity into enterprise risk management and bringing better board visibility, board being kind of an external government term, yeah. But like executive steering committee potentially inside the government. How do you think is the best way to explain cyber risk to other executives?
So, Ken, I actually have a talk I give about measuring cybersecurity and the 7 different ways I personally experienced, ranging from how much am I spending, to what am I buying, to what is it doing, to what difference does it make, things like threat, and then, information, confidentiality, integrity, availability, impact on mission. But you hit the holy grail, number 7, the risk word. What is the cyber risk and how do I normalize it compared to other things? And that's when you really have to have the conversation, from my perspective, with whoever is in charge of the organization to say, what is your risk tolerance? What is your risk appetite? What can we live with? What can we absorb? And then you have to say it's a risk, and the 4 T's kick in. What risks do I treat? I do something about it. You tell me how much money I'm willing to do. What risks do I transfer? For the private sector, it's through insurance. For the federal government, you typically don't have that kind of option. Which ones do I tolerate? I simply say, I have to do this to get the job done. And which ones do I terminate? Now that you've told me this is a risk, I'm just going to say, we're going to change the practice because I don't see an appealing way to solve it. But risk is normalizing risk is the one where you frankly struggle the most. And it's got to be a conversation that is, frankly, in my experience, driven more from the top. And that's a real challenge, I think, for government, where you have more turnover than you do in the private sector, where I know we talk about agency heads are ultimately responsible for data integrity. In my experience, I can only think of 2 cases where an agency head lost their job over a breach. It's a real challenge, I think, for government, Ken.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'll switch gears for a minute. With the pivot to work from home now, with this, the hybrid that we're getting into, automation is a key. There aren't enough people in government to do it. The work is getting more demanding, more voluminous. We're all talking about robotic process automation, RPA, and now, of course, it's child intelligent automation. So how does that intersect with securing access and with identity management?
We actually briefly touched on this in our privileged identity playbook, but we also have a digital worker identity playbook. And actually that digital worker identity playbook was a collaboration with the robotic process automation community of practice, and really looked at, there's 2 types of things, I'll say, in your network in cyberspace, right? You have your people accessing things, but to a much broader extent, and one that could be a potential risk, are your non-person entities. So non-person entity being anything besides a person in cyberspace. And that's just another digital identity that needs to be managed. So unlike a human user, our machine identities, digital workers are almost always created with an elevated privilege in mind, right? They're meant to either help automate something, they're help to inform someone on a process. One use case we had in our digital worker identity playbook was an analysis script that helped inform kind of doctor decision making. And what's in that digital worker identity playbook is a risk assessment to help understand what level of access this digital worker has and what is its job in a way, right? Is it meant to analyze and provide a public dashboard, so public information? Is it meant to analyze and provide recommendations that a person will take action on? There's also multiple types of digital workers or machine identities in the agency's network, right? These could include system accounts, which are actually required depending if you're in a Windows environment or Azure. A system account gets automatically created when you create applications. From a privileged user perspective, we have HHS keys. From just an integration of application standpoint, you've heard of APIs and other types of tokens that are used to integrate applications. A classic one that probably a lot of technology people think about are our public key infrastructure certificates, where that's to a website or even issued to different devices on your network, network printers, that sort of thing. So they're all required in a way, these non-person entities, these machine identities, whichever term you want to use, but they're there. They have inherent privilege, and they should be managed similar to our human users.
Well, and it's not RPA, but what about operational technology? When you talk about, the number of devices now that are intersecting with the federal workforce, ranging from, and I know this is a GSA goal, smart buildings, greater energy efficiency. Now, in the response to COVID, we've got increased health monitoring in buildings. And then the reality is you have some federal agencies that actually have a lot of operational technology that they don't do manufacturing per se, but they do a lot of things at scale that look like industrial processes. So I'm sure identity management is going to be key in that too, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I would even say like the machine identity is a part that's not like fully integrated into most ICAM programs, although we're working in that direction. There's no OMB memo 1917 that talked about managing an ICAM program, an agency ICAM program, and incorporating those non-person entities into your policy for a more holistic view of the people and things interacting on your network. And to your point, some of the operational tech that some agencies have also have identities and should be incorporated also.
Sure. I mean, these devices, whether it's a surveillance camera, whether it's, a camera around the building perimeter, whether it's a vehicle that, is part of your network, they've all, clearly you need identity. You need to unambiguously be able to know what that is and what it's doing and what it should be doing, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So data protection, that's a term that comes up a lot when we hear about breaches and cyber attacks. So what are FICAM best practices for protecting data?
So data protection is actually an OMB memo 2209 against federal zero trust strategy, and knowing how and where data is stored, accessed, and secured. So actually, previously coming to GSA, I actually worked in a data loss prevention area. And I always thought it was really interesting, understanding like the data lifecycle, where it's created on a device, in an application, ends up in a database, and then the protection of it when it's in movement, right? Because we access data on our laptops, on our mobile devices, we authenticate through a website, we interact with a website, and then how that data is kind of protected while it's being updated, manipulated. It's just kind of an interesting thing. I would say the first thing that FICAM touches on is a risk assessment. So conducting a risk assessment on the impact and likelihood of misuse or abuse of that data. And that also includes identifying which data types are sensitive and how it's protected. So this can get translated into like data tagging. NARA has our controlled unclassified information guidelines, but agencies usually have their own policy. But data tagging, I don't know why that word is so hard, but data tagging is pretty important at this part. So you factor in that data tagging, that you have the tools to be able to tag data, but also restrict access based on that. Part of restricting access could also be restricting movement, meaning that data can only be accessed from a specific application, and depending on what device you're on, would determine whether you can upload or download data to it. I mentioned protecting data and movement. That's kind of from three aspects. Data in transit. So these are the files that are moving not only to and from storage locations, right? Whether you're using Microsoft Office 365 or using Google, but the movement to and from. One interesting use case that often is not factored into this is most protection is based on the device. Like I am interacting with data and I'm uploading it from my device. But actually today, and maybe you've noticed it, is that you can save data from a website directly into a cloud storage without even traversing the device. And so if you have security controls based on data going to and from a device, that could be a potential gap in that. So if you have those data loss prevention controls for data movement, it's important to consider where that data is coming from. It's not traditionally from a device to an application. So two other aspects of protecting data movement mentioned data at rest, and that's what's mentioned in the federal zero trust strategy. So it's identifying that sensitive data, whether it's in a database, a file, a cloud storage location. And then also lastly is the live data. So agencies can look at implementing, or even organizations, about activity-based restrictions. That's a download and upload and edit to protect sensitive data. Maybe you only want data to be uploaded and downloaded from a corporate owned or a government furnished device and not from a personal device. So that's where some of those data loss prevention controls come in. Lastly, I mean, obviously from an identity perspective, architecting that identity access, right? Moving beyond the idea of we're securing the perimeter and focusing more on directly with that data. And that's actually mentioned also in the federal zero trust strategy as securing access more from an application than from a network perspective.
Right. And as you said, part of securing the data is encrypting the data. And, you know, it is, for a long time, the federal government has said we should encrypt data that was externally accessible or on removable media. And I give the zero trust strategy and systems maturity model full credit for saying part of this is let's encrypt data at rest as well. Because of course, we know that this helps both in the event of a breach, if someone's exfiltrating the data and it's stolen, also in the case of ransomware, which we've seen move from something that just encrypts your data on your system, where having the timely offline backups is a solution. Now, increasingly, you need to worry about somebody taking your data and doing something with it as well. So nothing, it's poetic justice for someone who's trying to run ransomware against you to say, you just stole encrypted data, so sorry. You know, not useful to you. So this is key, but yet to your point, Ken, identity management has got to be key because people inside need to be able to decrypt this. And yet your ability, in order to do that, you need to make sure that they are who they say they are and that they have a need to do that process, right? Down to identity. So you've clearly been involved in federal identity as a topic for some time now. So, and I know you've got federal partners. How can others get involved in this area to help the federal government? Or you've already given us some resources like idmanagement.gov where they can learn more about it. What are your thoughts on
that? For idmanagement.gov, it's actually hosted on GitHub. So that's one way that anyone can really help propose best practices or any updates. If you go to our website at the very bottom, you'll see a link that says edit this page. That'll take you to the GitHub where you can actually propose new content. If you want to just collaborate with us, we have a couple different ICAM communities of practice. I mentioned our ICAM subcommittee. That's typically only open to federal employees and contractors. We do have some working groups that are open a little bit broader. We have an ICAM tech list. And I mean, I wouldn't think about collaboration just from in the federal government. I mean, there's groups such as ATARC, right? You have a zero trust identity management working group that's open to partners. Actually, I just went to FCA, Federal Identity Expo, and that was an awesome opportunity interacting with a bunch of different identity professionals there also. Can you think of any others?
Yeah, you've mentioned a couple of big ones. I mean, clearly ATARC and clearly FCA. You know, I've been part of FCA Cyber for a very long time, and that's actually an international organization with local chapters. So those are ways that you can tie into the broader community of practice, both back to government and with partners and other partners in industry as well. Yeah. And then clearly there are organizations like NIST that one could reach out to as well, where they both do work in this area, and then they're working directly with you. So I think there are a lot of ways that people could get involved in this. So we're starting to wind down. So are there any other technologies or issues that we haven't discussed that you see as important right now, top of mind?
I know one big question that our office usually gets that's mentioned in the federal zero trust strategy is within one of the identity action steps, it says use phishing resistant authenticators, and specifically look at phishing resistant authenticators when a PIV card or a derived PIV is not practical. And so we'll often get the question, so how should an agency approach this? I'll break it down strictly from a technology perspective, right? Our PIV cards are based on public key infrastructure, PKI, and most modern cloud technology either doesn't support public key infrastructure, or it creates an additional kind of architecture components to be able to use that. In addition, the PIV card, being a smart card form factor, requires additional peripherals, like a card reader, maybe other middleware to be able to use that card. So for agencies to be kind of cyber resilient and kind of meet the intent of this phishing resistant authenticator, there's actually other types of phishing resistant authenticators that are allowed in the federal zero trust strategy. It specifically mentions Fast Identity Align or FIDO Alliance authenticators, and those are natively supported in like major technology that agencies buy today. So tied closely with this is another action step to centralize authentication. And I mean, we briefly talked about it, about using a single sign-on, which is one of the FICAM focus areas. But actually using single sign-on, and specifically a FEDRAMP single sign-on, is a great way for agencies to support using other types of phishing-resistant authenticators. And a lot of agencies have conducted their zero trust analysis that's called out for in OMB Memo 2209. And seeing that in centralizing all of their different identity platforms, that using a FedRAMP identity as a service is one of the most efficient ways of supporting a broader variety of phishing resistant authenticators, whether that's using a PIV card or using non-public key infrastructure authenticators, such as a FIDO2 security key, or native platform authenticators that come in our devices. So NIST is working on updating their special publication that talks about derived PIV, which is special publication 800-157. At the same time, they're also updating their digital identity guidelines to help clarify this term phishing resistant and how agencies can meet that.
So I know PIV is really something that's unique, or at least focused on the federal government. What about hardware tokens or software tokens for the private sector? You know, everybody's talking about single sign-on at the enterprise level. Are there solutions that would apply to non-federal users?
Yeah, actually for the non-federal community, I mean, FIDO2 is an industry standard. It's a nonprofit group. Like I mentioned, it's something that's shipped in by almost all major hardware providers. Like, for example, if you're using a Windows 10 device, it's natively supported. Apple has Face ID. So that's definitely something that industry can look at.
Okay. Sounds good. So we're winding down, Ken. Do you have any last thoughts? Anything you wish I'd asked? Anything you wanted to put out to the listening audience?
Yeah, I just want to leave with three things. I mean, first off, Jim, thank you very much for inviting me to come here today. Like I said, I have a passion for identity, and I feel like the more we get people involved in understanding what are those digital identity best practices, the better our technology and the better our interactions get. So from that perspective, we have our federally focused identity best practices guides, but again, they're technology and vendor agnostic. Is something that all organizations can use. So for federal agencies, if you have questions around digital identity, if you're concerned about different policy approaches, definitely feel free to reach out to our office at FICAM@gsa.gov. And lastly, so technology is becoming a primary foundation for most of our government work, either from an employee perspective in delivering our agency's mission, but also from a public perspective in how those services are used. So for many agencies and teams, that in-office time is evolving to focus more on our in-person collaborative meetings and activities. So we can think about where we shifted to more remote work. Now we're looking at kind of a broader hybrid perspective. So also along that technology perspective, From a user experience, delivering those mission services using our technology is key to ensuring that our public users have the most efficient and greatest customer experience in interacting with that. It's not really factored into our workforce, but from a security perspective, having efficient security processes can help improve our own workforce environment. I mean, you can think about, I mean, the best example I have is like password resets, right? The dreaded password reset, and trying to figure out what I did here, and the efficiency in resetting it also. So from that perspective, GSA, we work with agencies to create those innovative solutions and adapt to whatever that new reality is. Responding to challenges, but also taking advantage of those emerging opportunities to really deliver an exceptional experience.
Ken, I've really enjoyed talking with you. I was excited to have this one because from my perspective, digital identity is foundational to so many things we do that you can't really do cybersecurity without identity. You know, how can you do identity management? How can you do access control if you don't know who the users and the devices are? And, you know, while there clearly are times when we still do IT services where they're not about identity, where anonymity is fine, or where I don't really care when I go to check the weather, you know, it's not important. But for so much of what we do, not only in cybersecurity, but for IT as a transformative thing, the sinews of making that work are really digital identity. So being able to do it with efficiency, transparently, and securely is foundational. And I think GSA is really, really at the core of doing the conceptual definition and then driving the ways we build the technology. So I thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to do this. And for last thoughts from me, this is going to be the final podcast in this newscast series that started fairly early last year when we were exploring how the federal government was changing IT and security in response to the pandemic and other forces. We've heard about some really exciting work by federal agencies and their industry partners in these podcasts. And frankly, now it's time to roll up our sleeves and continue to tackle these problems. So on behalf of Fortinet, ATARC, and me, and in this case, Ken, thank you for taking the time to listen to us.
Thank you, Jim.